Question to DMs. What are some aspects of planning a campaign? For a beginner DM building their first campaign, it can be quite overwhelming. What are some aspects to take into consideration aside from main lore points? So this was the first post that I noticed that kind of asked about this topic, and as I started to think of what my answer might be, another post happened to come along. And it's simply, what's the biggest reason that D&D campaigns fail? Apparently there is supposed to be a poll attached to it, but for whatever reason it wouldn't load for me. So I took to the comments of it and some posts that were basically asking the same questions to see what the common answers were. So we've got scheduling, incompatible/differing playstyle preferences, scheduling, poor communication and mismatched expectations, scheduling, poor planning, including scheduling. To me, the most important part of planning a campaign, whether it's in D&D or a different TTRPG, is to make sure that the game actually happens. So even before I deep dive or commit into anything like world building or setting up a plot or anything like that, the first thing I take a look at is who's going to be playing in my game and whether or not they can actually maintain the commitment that's required for participating in some sort of ongoing campaign. Hi, I'm John. This is Dragon Mind, where we discover our best selves through gaming, and today we're discussing avoiding a failed campaign. Let's get into it. Yes, failed campaigns, the nightmare scenario for many game masters. Of course, it's only a nightmare because it is the flip side to the dream of running a big epic story with you and your friends, an ambition that many, if not most, GMs share when they choose to go to the other side of the screen. And we hear testimonials on forums and other mediums all the time of these big epic campaigns where the players experienced emotional catharsis, in-depth character development, and all sorts of wonderful things. And also, we get a certain expectation when we watch shows like Critical Role or Dimension 20, where we can see these things play out live on a stream. And, as you might expect, I'd hazard a guess that the number of failed campaigns far outnumbers the number of these successful epic ones. In fact, that's what I loved about the first opening question. What are some aspects we can consider when planning our campaign? As I mentioned in my previous video on my personal TTRPG journey, there was a moment many years ago where all of a sudden I found that I had a lot of friends that all wanted to try GMing around the same time. And in common, they all shared this ambition, either running this long-running narrative, or building this huge world that the players would play in, or something else really large in scale. Now, what I was getting frustrated for them was that when they'd sit down and actually run their first game, they would run these killer first sessions. I mean, like, everybody was having a good time, the rulings all made sense. There were usual stumbling blocks, of course, they were new GMs, but for the most part, in terms of the quality of how the session ran, you really couldn't ask for much better. And yet, when it came to maybe the second or even the third session, the campaign that they'd been so excited about had already fallen apart. And ultimately, it really had nothing to do with any of the usual things that you hear GMs advise about. It didn't really have a lot to do with world building or dramatic tension or theater of the mind versus maps and minis or whatever. It all had to do with the fact that they had recruited a player roster that had not proven itself capable of actually attending the ongoing games that would make the campaign happen. And I think that's the thing that's so tough about this topic, is it wasn't for a lack of wanting to be involved. In fact, the players they'd recruited were just as enthusiastic as the GMs themselves. It's just that reasonable things would start to come up. They either had a surprise work shift that they had to cover, or there was a kid's dance recital they had to go to, or they just had a really stressful week and D&D was going to be more taxing than it was going to be relaxing. And hey, I've totally been there too. One of the trends I was noticing in the comments a lot of these forums was all this judgment at players, as if D&D should be their top priority. But again, sometimes we don't know what we're getting into. which is why ultimately I developed the 7 baby steps for masterful game mastering, with step 1 being to start with a one-shot. The reason that this came about was exactly what I'm going to advise now. When prepping a campaign, you want to know that your players are actually able to commit, whether or not they want to commit. And you test that with a few one-shots first. This way, if you have, say, 6 players starting, and 2 of them after the first game can't seem to make the regular schedule, well, now you have some information that you can approach them with. And that doesn't mean that you can't ever play with them again, but it does mean that the campaign format, the long ongoing story, is not going to be a fit for the frequency that they're able to attend. Or the flip side, sometimes you start with someone that might come to the game a little lukewarm, but after the first or second session, they really get this passion ignited within them, and they really double down on their love for the game. Which is another consideration that I think can be a painful truth for a lot of GMs. Just because someone is a very good friend outside of a TTRPG does not mean that they'll be a good match at the table. I have plenty of friends that are also TTRPG enthusiasts, but we have some pretty stark disagreements on what constitutes a fun game. Some friends of mine like running really deadly games where players can just get killed off at any time. I personally find that when I've run games like that, players get less invested in their characters. I have some friends that really like being kind of objective rules judges for whatever game they're running. I'm not like that. And the players that I've ended up recruiting over time are ones that appreciate and harmonize with my style. But again, it's been over years and years of experimentation of finding out what's going to be the best game style for all of us. And that's really what one-shots allow you to do. You don't have to worry about keeping a weekly schedule. You get to understand what your ideal rhythm is. And if you truly can keep the entire story within the context of a single session, well, now even if the whole group fizzles and we just can't ever get together again, instead of dwelling on the campaign that never was, you get to look back fondly at a fun time you had with your friends that had a satisfying conclusion. I found for me, when I made that little psychological shift, instead of talking about all the campaigns I tried that didn't manifest, I started getting to talk more and more about these fun pockets of stories I was able to have with my friends. And I will say, of GMs who I've talked to about this, even some that have tried this, a lot of them just really can't break the habit of either stretching out a story to try to encompass multiple sessions, or to try to plant the seed of a future adventure inside the one-shot they're running. To me, it's kind of like a television pilot, where you're trying to prove a premise and test the chemistry of everyone at the table. And if something feels off, well, then that's okay. But if everyone at the table is really clicking and everyone agrees they want more of it, well, now you can build into something later. I kind of think of it a little bit like The Legend of Vox Machina, where those first 2 episodes were like really obviously just supposed to be their own thing. They ended up getting tied into the greater story later on, once they actually found out that they were gonna get budgeted for many more episodes. But still, it's a part of the outside campaign planning that I found builds resiliency for an ongoing campaign. And in fact, that's also kind of how I run my campaigns now. I've actually had very little success running TTRPGs as they're usually understood. You know, where we'll pause now and pick up next week. The most consistently successful campaigns I've ran are really like an episode of network television. There's usually some overarching plot that may tie various episodes together. But when my group sits down for a session, there is an episode of the week where they're confronted by some kind of quest that may or may not be connected to the overarching narrative, but it's a job that they can get introduced to and complete all within that single session. And those kind of one-shots end up stacking up over time. And then you can look back and go, wow, we ran 60, 70 sessions. And sometimes it's through these somewhat side questy missions that some of the most profound character development actually takes place. Again, I've had a lot of GM friends try to argue against this model. And yet, when I'm looking at the number of games I've actually started and then completed versus the amount of games they have, well, the data kind of speaks for itself. Now, of course, there are going to be limitations to this format, but they're ones we're willing to concede on because they're not to our tastes really anyway. For example, can't really run dungeon crawls that way. That's okay. I'm not really a big fan of dungeon crawls to begin with. You're also not going to do the thing where you tax the player character's resources over time. That's okay. Both my players and I enjoy when they're fully rested and I get to just design an interesting encounter without trying to tire them out over time, unless there's some specific event where we have an understanding that's gonna be like, all right, in this one, there's gonna be a series of combat encounters and your player characters are probably gonna get tired out. So overall, I would say probably the most important aspect to preparing a campaign is figuring out what needs to happen for you and your group to prevent it from fizzling. I accomplish this by testing their behavior, not their promises, by seeing if they can actually attend sessions consistently, and also a little bit of chemistry tests so that all that interpersonal stuff that can also kind of muck up a game, to try to just make sure everyone gets along before we decide to take on a bigger commitment. And then I actually build my campaign one shot at a time, while also feeding through this overarching thread until we get to some climactic event. So now I'd love to hear what you have to say. How would you answer OP's original question? In your experience, what's the biggest reason for failed campaigns? Are there ways that you found that have helped a campaign continue that I haven't mentioned? Let me know in the comments below. Speaking of TTRPGs, in the description to this video are links to playtest materials for my TTRPG, Swiftguard. I'd love to hear your feedback either in the comments of this video or in the Swiftguard community Discord, also linked in the description. Have an awesome day, and remember, your story matters. Bye-bye now.